The mist clings to the limestone peaks of the Annamite Range like a shroud. It is November 1962. We are deep within the sovereign territory of Laos, a country officially declared neutral by the Geneva Accords just months prior. But in the suffocating humidity of the jungle floor, neutrality is a fiction. High on a jagged ridge overlooking the plain of Jars, a small reconnaissance unit of the Pathet Lao, accompanied by a Soviet technical advisor, crouches in the mud. They are watching a mountain peak that should be uninhabitable. According to their maps, there are no roads leading to this summit. There are no rivers capable of carrying heavy barges. The terrain is a nightmare of vertical cast towers and dense, triple-canopy jungle. It is a place where an army should starve in a week. And yet, through his binoculars, the Soviet advisor sees something that defies the logistics of modern warfare. He sees a city in the clouds. Smoke rises from cooking fires. He counts not dozens, but hundreds of Hmong guerrillas moving with purpose. They are carrying brand new M1 carbines. They are wearing boots. They are well fed. In the center of this impossible outpost, cut violently into the side of the mountain, is a strip of dirt. It is perhaps 200 meters long, angled steeply uphill, ending abruptly at a sheer cliff face. It is not an airstrip. It is a suicide run. No fixed-wing aircraft in the Soviet inventory could land there. A helicopter perhaps, but the altitude and the unpredictable updrafts make rotary operations treacherous and low capacity. Then the sound comes. It is a low drone, distinct from the scream of a jet engine or the chop of a rotor. It is the sound of a single piston engine straining against the thin mountain air. The advisor scans the grey sky. Out of the cloud bank, a silver shape materializes. It is not a bomber. It is not a fighter jet. It looks, absurdly, like a civilian utility plane, a pilotless porter. The aircraft drops from the sky with a violence that makes the advisor flinch. It does not glide, it falls, aiming directly for the cliff face. At the last second, the pilot flares the aircraft, slamming the wheels onto the steep dirt strip. The plane bounces, roars, and shudders to a halt less than 50 feet from the precipice. Before the propeller even stops spinning, the side door is kicked open. Men in jeans and sunglasses jump out. They are not wearing military uniforms. They look like mechanics or tourists who took a wrong turn into hell. They begin unloading crates, ammunition, rice, medical supplies with practiced efficiency. Within 10 minutes, the plane spins around on the precarious ledge, revs its engine to a scream, and throws itself off the cliff, catching the air and vanishing back into the clouds. The Soviet advisor lowers his binoculars. He is a man trained in the doctrine of heavy armor and supply lines, of railheads and truck convoys. What he has just witnessed is a logistical impossibility. There is no army on Earth that operates this way. He writes in his logbook, his hand damp with sweat. He notes the markings on the tail of the aircraft. 2 words, painted in a friendly corporate font that belongs on a travel brochure, not in a war zone. Air America. This is the beginning of the Ghost War. If you want to understand the hidden mechanics of the Cold War and the shadowy operations that defined the 20th century, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We are declassifying the history they didn't want you to see. The confusion among the communist forces in Laos was not merely tactical, it was existential. In the early 1960s, the North Vietnamese army, supported by the Soviet Union and China, was beginning to construct the massive logistical network that would become the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Their doctrine was built on predictability and mass. You build a road, you drive a truck, you supply the front. It was slow, it was grinding, and it was visible. But this new enemy in the mountains refused to play by the laws of physics or war. Reports began filtering back to Hanoi and Moscow, creating a picture that made no sense to the intelligence analysts at the KGB. The reports described a fleet of aircraft that seemed to be everywhere at once. One day, a heavy C-123 transport plane would be spotted dropping pallets of livestock, live pigs and chickens into a village completely surrounded by Pathet Lao forces. The next day, a tiny single-engine helio courier would be seen landing in a forest clearing smaller than a football field to extract a wounded guerrilla leader. The Soviet military attaches in Vientiane were baffled. They knew the United States was supporting the Royal Lao government, but the US Air Force was officially restricted. There were no massive air bases being built in the remote provinces. There were no convoys of American trucks crossing the border. Yet, deep in the enemy rear, an entire secret army of 30,000 Hmong fighters was being fed, clothed and armed by a phantom logistical network. Who were these pilots? Intelligence intercepts added to the confusion. The pilots did not use standard military call signs. They spoke in a casual cowboy vernacular. They joked over the radio frequencies. They sounded like commercial airline pilots complaining about the weather, yet they were flying into some of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire on the planet. When a Pathet Lao anti-aircraft battery finally managed to shoot one of these planes down in late 1962, the wreckage offered more questions than answers. The pilot carried no military identification. There were no dog tags. The aircraft had civilian registration numbers. The cargo manifest listed humanitarian aid. Yet scattered among the sacks of hard rice, the code name for ammunition were crates of gold bars used to pay the tribal warlords. The Soviet analysts looked at the debris and saw a paradox. This was a commercial enterprise. It was a business. But it was a business that possessed the logistical power of a nation-state and the secrecy of a spy ring. The stakes for the Soviet Union and their North Vietnamese allies were rapidly escalating. The Steel Tiger, the communist supply line moving south, was being bled dry by these ghosts. Every time the North Vietnamese army tried to secure a sector in the Plain of Jars, they would find themselves ambushed by guerrillas who had been resupplied from the sky just hours before. The enemy was fluid. They did not need roads. They did not need bridges. They only needed a patch of dirt and a gap in the clouds. By 1964, the paranoia within the communist leadership was palpable. They were fighting a war against a shadow. They began to suspect that the Americans had developed a new class of aircraft or a new doctrine of vertical envelopment that rendered traditional siege warfare obsolete. The Soviet advisors on the ground urged their commanders to find the source. Where were these planes coming from? How could a civilian airline, if that is what it truly was, sustain such a high operational tempo in monsoon conditions that grounded the Soviet-made Ilyushin transports? In the halls of the Kremlin, the question was asked with growing frustration. How is a private company defeating the logistical might of the People's Army? The answer, they feared, was a new American superweapon. But it wasn't a weapon of steel and gunpowder. It was a weapon of organization. A shell game played with shell companies, hiding the largest covert operation in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. But to the men on the ground, looking up at the silver wings buzzing through the mist, it was simply magic. And it was terrifying. The Phantom Airline was changing the geometry of the war, and the Soviets had no idea how to shoot down a ghost. The rainy season of 1964 transformed the capital city of Vientiane into a steam bath of intrigue. To the casual observer, the city was a sleepy colonial outpost, fading into the muddy banks of the Mekong River. But inside the Soviet embassy, a squat, fortress-like compound, the air conditioning units rattled day and night, struggling to cool the feverish work of the GRU Soviet military intelligence. They were not hunting for nuclear codes or ballistic missile sites. They were hunting for a corporation. The investigation began with a ledger. A Soviet intelligence officer, tasked with monitoring commercial air traffic in Southeast Asia, had noticed a statistical anomaly that was impossible to ignore. According to official flight logs filed with the Laotian Civil Aviation Authority, a company calling itself Air America was operating a modest fleet of charter planes for humanitarian aid. Their stated mission was carrying rice and salt to remote villages. But the officer's surveillance photographs told a different story. He spread the glossy black and white prints across his desk. They showed the apron of Huatay Airport. In the foreground stood the legitimate commercial airliners, Royal Air Lao, Air France, Aeroflot. But parked in the civilian hangars were aircraft that had been modified in ways that violated every safety protocol in the Soviet handbook. There were C-46 Commandos, World War II-era relics, fitted with extra fuel tanks that should have made them too heavy to take off. There were helicopters painted in dark, non-reflective blues and greys, devoid of the bright markings required for civilian safety. And then there were the men. The zoom lens had captured them lounging by the hangars. They wore gold bracelets, Rolex watches, and Hawaiian shirts unbuttoned to the sternum. They drank beer at 10 in the morning. They did not salute. They did not march. The Soviet officer noted in his report that this airline possessed more aircraft than the Royal Laotian Air Force. In fact, if the estimates were correct, this private company had the largest air fleet in Southeast Asia. The Kremlin demanded to know the chain of command. In the Soviet military doctrine, an air wing of this size required a general, a headquarters, a political commissar, and a rigid hierarchy. They ordered their agents in Vientiane to find the general in charge of Air America. They found nothing. Instead of a military headquarters, the trail led to a labyrinth of shell companies. When KGB agents tried to trace the ownership of the aircraft tails, they were led into a hall of mirrors. One plane was registered to a Pacific Engineering Company in Delaware. Another belonged to a CAT Incorporated in Taiwan. A third was leased from a holding company in Liechtenstein. It was a capitalist shell game designed to induce vertigo. The Soviets were baffled. They were attempting to fight a war against a phantom entity that existed only on paper, yet dropped tons of ordnance on their allies in the jungle. The investigation moved from the paperwork to the field, and here, the confusion turned into dread. North Vietnamese interrogators began questioning captured Hmong guerrillas. They asked about the American military officers directing the airstrikes. The prisoners, often teenagers, looked confused. They spoke not of soldiers, but of the sky people. They described pilots who landed in weather that grounded birds. They spoke of a store in the sky that brought them whatever they asked for: rifles, radios, silver bars, and even live ducks. One interrogation report, forwarded to Moscow in late 1965, described an event that the Soviet analysts dismissed as a hallucination. A captured guerrilla claimed that a massive C-123 transport plane had landed on a dirt strip so short that the pilot had to use reverse rockets to stop. The analysts noted that while JATO jet-assisted takeoff was a known technology, the concept of using rockets to stop a heavy transport on a mountain peak was suicidal madness. No pilot would attempt it. It was physically impossible. They were wrong. The Soviets were analyzing the situation through the lens of pilot safety and regulation. They did not understand that the men flying for Air America had discarded the rulebook years ago. As the months dragged on, the Air America phenomenon became a bogeyman within the communist ranks. The NVA soldiers moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail learned to fear the sound of a slow-moving piston engine more than the scream of a jet. A jet was fast. It dropped its bombs and left. But the Air America porters and helio couriers, the butterflies, as the locals called them, would loiter. They would circle for hours, watching, marking, and calling in destruction. The Soviet advisors on the ground felt a growing sense of impotence. They brought in heavy anti-aircraft artillery, 37mm and 57mm guns. These were weapons designed to shred formations of bombers. But the Air America pilots flew so low, hugging the limestone karsts, that the radar couldn't lock onto them. They flew through the valleys, not over them. A report from a Soviet radar operator stationed near the Plain of Jars captures the frustration perfectly. "The target appears and disappears within seconds," he wrote. "They fly below the tree line. We track them, and then they vanish into the side of the mountain." They weren't vanishing. They were landing on the secret Lima sites, the hundreds of rough dirt strips the CIA had carved into the ridges. To the Soviets, these strips were invisible. Their maps showed only jagged peaks. They couldn't conceive that the Americans had turned the mountains themselves into aircraft carriers. The investigation led the Soviets to a series of wrong conclusions that would prove fatal to their strategy. First, they concluded that this was a massive, top-secret US Air Force operation using a new type of stealth doctrine. They assumed the drunk civilians at the airport were deep-cover operatives, the best of the best, highly disciplined actors playing a role. They couldn't accept the truth, that these men really were mercenaries, misfits, and adrenaline junkies who flew for money and the thrill of the game. Second, they believed the aircraft possessed advanced electronic countermeasures. How else could a slow, single-engine plane survive in the most heavily defended airspace in the world? The Soviets wasted millions of rubles upgrading their radar systems, searching for electronic jamming signals that didn't exist. The jamming was simply the pilot's insane courage to fly 10 feet off the deck in a monsoon. By 1966, the legend of the ghost airline had paralyzed the decision-making process of the Pathet Lao. They began to see the enemy everywhere. Every civilian plane was a bomber. Every clearing in the jungle was a potential invasion point. The KGB resident in Vientiane sent a final, desperate cable to Moscow summarizing the situation. "We are fighting a hydra," he wrote. "We shoot one down and the next day 2 more appear, painted in different colors, registered to a different company. They do not fight like soldiers, they fight like smugglers. And they are everywhere." The Soviets had spent years looking for a military solution to a logistical problem. They were looking for a head to cut off, but Air America had no head. It was a sprawling, chaotic, self-correcting organism. And while the Soviets chased paper trails and radar ghosts, the Americans were about to introduce a new asset to the game. Something that would take the concept of impossible and elevate it to a technological art form. The investigation was over. The Soviets realized they weren't dealing with a rogue airline. They were dealing with a limitless budget and a total lack of oversight. The mystery of who they were was fading, replaced by the terrifying question of what they would do next. The answer lay in a secret facility halfway across the world, where American engineers were building a machine that would turn the vertical mountains of Laos into a highway. While the Soviets hunted for ghosts in the mist-shrouded peaks of Laos, chasing radar phantoms and interrogating confused villagers, the source of their misery was being managed from a mundane office building halfway across the world. The address was 1724 F Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. To the casual pedestrian, it was just another grey limestone facade in a city of bureaucrats. But inside, legal experts and accountants were managing the Pacific Corporation, a holding company with a board of directors that answered to only one shareholder, the Central Intelligence Agency. The American solution to the problem of fighting a war in a neutral country, forbidden by the Geneva Accords, was not a new weapon system. It was a corporate structure. The genius of the American strategy lay in a concept called plausible deniability, weaponized on an industrial scale. The CIA realized early on that they could not send the United States Air Force into Laos. The political fallout would be catastrophic. Tanks would bog down in the mud, trucks would be bombed on the few existing roads. The geography of Laos was a fortress designed by nature to repel a conventional army. So, the Americans decided to ignore the geography entirely. They initiated a project that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of aviation. The centerpiece of this project was not a supersonic jet or a high-altitude spy plane, but a deceptively simple-looking aircraft that the Soviet analysts had dismissed as a toy. It was the Helio Courier. From a distance, the Courier looked like a standard civilian light aircraft, perhaps something a doctor would fly on weekends. But underneath its aluminum skin, it was an aerodynamic freak of nature. Designed by an MIT professor, the Courier was engineered to do the impossible. It could fly slower than a car drives on a highway without falling out of the sky. The secret lay in its wings. They were equipped with automatic leading-edge slats devices that popped out when the airspeed dropped, smoothing the airflow and generating lift at speeds as low as 28 miles per hour. While a Soviet MiG-21 needed a mile of concrete to take off, the Helio Courier could leap into the air in less than 300 feet. It could take off from a soccer field, a village square, or a ridgeline clearing. This was the magic the Soviet advisor had witnessed in Part 1. The aircraft wasn't hovering, it was flying in a regime of physics that Soviet doctrine said was impossible for a fixed-wing transport. But the aircraft was only half the equation. The American ingenuity truly shone in the infrastructure they built to support it. The CIA didn't just buy planes, they built a secret country within a country. The project was codenamed the Lima Sites. Recognizing that there were no airports in the jungle, the CIA's paramilitary officers, led by the legendary Tony Poe and working with the Hmong leader General Vang Pao, began a massive engineering program using nothing but hand tools and explosives. They didn't wait for the Army Corps of Engineers, they simply blew the tops off mountains. They created a network of over 400 secret landing strips scattered across the wildest terrain on Earth. These were known as Lima Sites, numbered simply LS1, LS2, and so on. Some were one-way strips. You landed uphill, turned around, and took off downhill off a cliff. If you missed the approach, you died. If your engine failed on takeoff, you died. This network turned the entire country of Laos into a dispersed aircraft carrier. The Soviet strategy of cutting supply lines became irrelevant because there were no supply lines. The supply line was the sky. At the heart of this secret empire was Lima Site 20 Amperes, also known as Long Tieng. In 1962, Long Tieng was a valley inhabited by a few squirrels. By 1968, it was the second largest city in Laos, with a population of 30,000, yet it appeared on no map. It was a secret city, a bustling metropolis of spies, pilots, guerrillas and support staff, hidden inside a bowl of limestone mountains that shielded it from radio signals and prying eyes. The sheer audacity of Long Tieng was the ultimate expression of American dominance. While the Soviet economy struggled to produce basic consumer goods, the CIA had airlifted bulldozers, generators, radar systems, and an entire frozen food section into a valley accessible only by air. They built a paved runway, a hospital, and a bar, the infamous Purple Porpoise, where pilots debriefed over cold beer after dodging anti-aircraft fire. The pilots themselves were the final piece of the puzzle. The CIA recruiters didn't look for soldiers who followed orders. They looked for aviators who could think in 3 dimensions. They recruited smoke jumpers from Montana, bush pilots from Alaska, and crop dusters from the Midwest. They paid them exorbitant salaries tax-free and gave them a simple directive: get the rice and the guns to the bad guys, and don't get caught. These men, flying their STOL, short takeoff and landing aircraft, developed a new kind of warfare. They didn't fly over the mountains, they flew around them. They knew every valley, every updraft, every tree. They could drop a sack of rice onto a porch from 500 feet. They could land a helicopter on a pinnacle so sharp that only one skid could touch the rock, balancing the machine while troops jumped out the other side. The Americans had effectively hacked the war. The Soviets were playing chess, moving pieces slowly across a board. The Americans were playing 3D poker. They had bought an entire airline, staffed it with mercenaries, equipped it with physics-defying technology, and built a secret infrastructure that rendered the enemy's terrain advantage null and void. By the late 1960s, Air America was no longer just a supply operation. It had evolved into a full-spectrum air force. They were flying search and rescue missions for downed US Air Force pilots. They were transporting VIPs. They were even dropping hard rice weapons directly into firefights. The source of the mystery was not magic. It was money, engineering, and a complete disregard for the conventional rules of engagement. The Americans had built a system that was flexible, lethal, and invisible to the traditional military mind. But secrecy has a shelf life. The scale of the operation at Longtieng was becoming too massive to hide. The amount of aluminum filling the sky was casting a shadow that even the most confused Soviet analyst could no longer ignore. The investigation was about to end, not with a whisper, but with a shocking confrontation that would force the communist powers to accept a humiliating reality. They were being beaten by a company. The pieces were all in place for the moment of truth. The ghost was about to become flesh and blood, and the Soviets were about to realize just how far behind they really were. For years, the Soviet intelligence apparatus had treated the Air America problem as a tactical nuisance. They believed they were chasing a small, elite cadre of smugglers operating out of bamboo huts. They estimated the operation involved perhaps a dozen planes and a few hundred personnel. The truth did not arrive in a dossier or a decoded message. It arrived when the North Vietnamese army finally climbed high enough to look over the wall. It is the dry season of 1969. The North Vietnamese army, supported by Soviet advisors and heavy armor, launches a massive offensive Campaign 139 to finally crush the Hmong resistance at its source. They push relentlessly across the Plain of Jars, capturing territory mile by bloody mile. Their goal is a set of limestone ridges known as Skyline. The Soviet strategists believed that if they could take the high ground, they would look down upon the enemy's hidden base, call in artillery, and wipe the guerrilla camp off the map. On a clear afternoon, a forward observation unit of the NVA, exhausted and mud-stained, finally hacks its way to the crest of Skyline Ridge. They set up their optics, preparing to coordinate fire on what they expect to be a primitive village. The commander looks through his binoculars into the valley below. He freezes. He does not see a camp. He sees a sprawling, electrified metropolis glowing in the twilight. Below him lies Longtieng. It is a sight that defies every assumption of the war. He sees a paved runway stretching across the valley floor. He sees rows of warehouses, barracks, a radio station, and a bank. He sees jeeps driving on graded roads. He sees electric streetlights. And most shockingly, he sees the air traffic. It is a swarm. The observer watches in disbelief as planes land and take off with a frequency that seems mechanically impossible. A T-28 Trojan fighter bomber roars into the sky every 30 seconds. C-123 transports are taxiing in a continuous loop, engines never shutting down, disgorging troops and supplies before turning around to fly back to Thailand. Helicopters buzz like angry hornets, filling the gaps between the fixed-wing traffic. The report that goes back to the Soviet advisors is met with absolute silence. The ghost is not a ghost. It is a logistical juggernaut. The shock moment hits the Soviet intelligence community when they finally process the data from this observation. They run the numbers on the flight frequency. They compare it to civilian air traffic data from around the globe. The conclusion is a statistical absurdity that they check 3 times before accepting. This secret valley, which appears on no map, which has no road access, which is officially neutral, is currently the busiest airport in the world. During peak daylight hours, Longtieng is handling more takeoffs and landings than Chicago O'Hare or New York Kennedy. The CIA has not just built an airline. They have built the logistical equivalent of a major American city in the middle of a Neolithic jungle. The Soviet realization is devastating. They've been trying to starve an enemy that has a limitless high-speed conveyor belt to the American industrial base. The Hmong fighters aren't rationing bullets, they are drowning in them. The response from the communist forces is furious and desperate. They realize they cannot outfly this airline. They must destroy the ground it lands on. The Soviets rush their heaviest artillery pieces to the front, the feared M46 130mm field guns. These weapons have a range of 27 kilometers, enough to hit the runway from the safety of the jungle. They begin a relentless bombardment. Shells rain down on the valley floor. The runway is cratered. The warehouses burn. The Soviet doctrine states that under heavy artillery barrage, air operations must cease. No pilot can land on a runway that is exploding. But this is where the Soviets fail to understand the culture of Air America. Instead of retreating, the Air America pilots adapt with a terrifying nonchalance. They begin flying the corkscrew approach. Arriving high over the valley above the trajectory of the artillery shells, they cut their engines and drop the aircraft into a spiraling freefall, twisting tightly inside the bowl of the mountains to stay within the radar shadow. They pull out of the dive feet above the runway, touch down, offload while rolling, and take off again before the next salvo of shells can bracket their position. The Soviet advisors watch through their scopes as a C-123 lands between artillery impacts. It is a display of airmanship that borders on the suicidal. The pilots treat the shelling not as a military interdiction, but as bad weather, just another hazard to be navigated. The futile response becomes clear. The NVA throws waves of infantry, tanks, and artillery at the valley. They eventually force evacuations. They eventually threaten the perimeter, but they never stop the flow. Even as the enemy breaches the outer defenses, the silver planes keep coming, extracting refugees, dropping ammo, and evacuating the wounded. The Soviets had hoped to reveal the American weakness, their reliance on technology. Instead, the confrontation revealed a terrifying American strength, the ability to maintain a complex, high-tech supply chain in the middle of chaos. The capitalist shell game was harder than steel. The mystery was solved. The Soviets knew what it was, they knew where it was, and they knew how it worked. But looking down at that valley, watching a beat-up cargo plane defy a barrage of Soviet steel, they realized something profound. You can shell a runway, but you cannot shell a philosophy. The airline was never just about planes. It was about the relentless, overwhelming application of resources. And as the war drew to its bitter close, the legacy of this impossible airline would be measured not in the battles it won, but in the sheer, staggering statistics of its existence. The end of the mystery did not bring peace. It brought a frantic, heartbreaking crescendo. By the spring of 1975, the geopolitical tides had turned irreversibly. The Americans were leaving Southeast Asia. The funding for the ghost airline was cut. The impossible city in the clouds, Longtieng, was about to be swallowed by the jungle from which it had been carved. The final days of Air America were a microcosm of the entire operation, chaotic, heroic, and tragic. As the North Vietnamese army finally breached the perimeter defenses of the valley, the pilots flew their last sorties. They were not carrying weapons anymore. They were carrying people. In scenes of desperate panic, Hmong families who had fought for the CIA for 15 years flooded the runway. The pilots, disobeying direct orders to save only American personnel, overloaded their aircraft. C-46 transports designed to carry 40 people took off with over 100 souls on board, the landing gear skimming the treetops, the engines groaning under the weight of betrayal. When the last silver plane lifted off from Longtieng in May 1975, it left behind not just a city, but a testament to a specific kind of American power. To understand why the KGB was so baffled, and why the Soviet Union ultimately lost the Cold War, you only need to look at the numbers generated by this single civilian company. In the span of its operation, Air America did not just support a guerrilla army, It fed a nation. In 1970 alone, this covert airline dropped 46,000 tons of food to refugees and fighters scattered across the mountains. Let that sink in. The Soviet Union struggled for decades to maintain a single overland supply route, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, requiring hundreds of thousands of laborers, constant repairs, and a massive anti-aircraft umbrella. The Americans, using a private company, moved the equivalent of 3 Liberty ships worth of cargo by air into territory that had no roads, no infrastructure, and no government. The killer statistic that haunted the Soviet analysts was the cost per kill and cost per calorie. The Soviet system was heavy, centralized, and expensive. Every bullet that reached the front line via the communist supply chain cost a fortune in fuel and manpower. The American system, decentralized and run like a business, delivered supplies for pennies on the dollar compared to military transport. The Soviets fired an estimated 6 million rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition at Air America planes over Laos. They shot down over 200 aircraft. But for every plane they downed, the Americans simply bought 2 more. The Soviet economy, rigid and planned, could not compete with the elasticity of American industrial capitalism. The story of Air America exposes the fundamental flaw that eventually cracked the Soviet foundation. The KGB was baffled because they were looking for a military solution to an economic problem. They saw the Cold War as a contest of strength. Who has the biggest tank, the fastest jet, the largest bomb? They built the MiG-25 to fly at Mach 3, a marvel of brute force engineering. But the Americans approached the Cold War as a contest of logistics and management. Air America was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It proved that a messy, unregulated, profit-driven enterprise could outmaneuver a rigid, top-down military command. The pilots of Air America were not following a 5-year plan. They were improvising. They fixed planes with duct tape. They traded supplies for favors. They operated with a flexibility that a Soviet commander would have been court-martialed for even thinking about. The Soviets failed to understand that the American weapon wasn't the plane. It was the system that allowed the plane to exist. It was the ability to create a Pacific engineering company out of thin air, fund it with black budget dollars, and let it loose to rewrite the map. The Soviets could copy the atom bomb. They could copy the B-29 bomber. But they could not copy the chaotic, innovative spirit of a private enterprise. Today, the mist still clings to the limestone peaks of the Annamite Range. The jungle has reclaimed the secret city of Longtieng. The paved runway, once the busiest in the world, is cracked and fading, used now by local farmers to dry grain in the Sunday. The wreckages of the Silver Plains, the Helio Couriers, the Porters, the Cone 123 Seconds have long since been stripped for scrap metal, turned into spoons and cooking pots by the villagers. The physical evidence of the mystery has been erased, but the ghost remains. For the historians and the military strategists who study this era, the lesson is clear. The Soviet Union didn't just lose because they ran out of money. They lost because they were fighting a war of attrition against a phantom they couldn't comprehend. They were prepared to fight the US Air Force. They were not prepared to fight a corporation. In the end, the KGB's confusion was the highest compliment they could have paid to the architects of the Shadow War. They looked at a ragtag fleet of mercenaries flying into the teeth of their air defenses and asked, "How is this possible?" The answer was simple, and it was the one thing the Soviet Union could never admit. The Americans didn't just buy an airline, they bought the sky.